On September 15th, 1971, at Camp David in Maryland, Richard Nixon sat across from his advisors and made a decision that would quietly unravel the global financial order. What he did that night, severing the dollar from gold, was stage 5 of a pattern that has destroyed empires for 3,000 years. And right now, in 2025, we're watching it happen again. 6 months of pulling apart historical records, central bank data, and obscure economic research that most people will never read revealed something disturbing. Spain's collapse in the 1600s, Britain's unraveling after 2 world wars, and the Soviet Union's disintegration in 900 days all followed the same mechanical sequence. 7 stages, always the same order, and every empire that's hit stage 5 has followed the exact same script toward the end. The question that should unsettle you is this: if we're at stage 5 right now, and the evidence suggests we are, what do stages 6 and 7 look like, and how much time do we actually have before the system snaps? What we're really talking about here isn't politics or left versus right, it's math. The math behind empire collapse follows a pattern so consistent and so repeatable that once you see it, you can't unsee it. The life cycle of empires runs from rise to peak to decline, and the timeline averages roughly 250 years or 10 generations, based on data from 8 major empires studied over 3 millennia. The Assyrians, the Persians, Rome, the Ottomans, the British, Spain, and the USSR all lasted about 250 years before collapsing, and the United States is 249 years old. What matters for you personally is your savings, your job, your ability to retire, and the value of the dollars sitting in your bank account. All of it rests on the assumption that the system stays stable, that the dollar remains trusted, and that the institutions hold. If history is any guide, that assumption is about to be tested in ways most people aren't prepared for, because at stage 5 things still look fine on the surface. The economy grows slowly, but it grows. Inflation ticks up, but remains manageable, and the stock market hits new highs while underneath the foundation cracks. And those cracks widen. The question becomes, how did we end up in a system this fragile without anyone noticing? This pattern didn't start with us, it started centuries ago, and every time it plays out, the people living through it think they're different and that they figured out how to avoid what happened to everyone else. They're always wrong. Spain from 1590 to 1670 experienced 80 years of slow motion collapse. At its peak, the empire controlled territory across Europe, the Americas and Asia, and silver poured in from mines in Potosi, in quantities that made Spain think it was invincible. What nobody understood at the time was that they weren't creating wealth. They were consuming it. Military spending devoured 50% of the empire's revenue, and when you spend that much on war, you've only got 2 choices: raise taxes until your people revolt or debase the currency. Spain did both. Bread prices tripled in 20 years as inflation exploded from more money chasing fewer goods. Spain stopped making things because why bother manufacturing when you can just import everything with silver? Except the silver started running out, the mines depleted, and when the money stopped flowing, the whole system seized up. Portugal broke away by 1640, the Netherlands was gone by 1650, and by 1670, Spain was a shell. Technically still an empire, but economically dead. You might be thinking that was just Spain, a different era and a different economy, which is exactly what everyone thinks until you see it happen again. Britain from 1914 to 1954 collapsed over 40 years. After World War I, Britain became the world's largest debtor nation, drowning in debt owed to the United States. The war had cost everything, and to pay for it, Britain borrowed heavily, but debt has a cost, and that cost is your future. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, and the pound lost 25% of its value overnight, which meant people woke up one morning with savings worth a quarter less than the day before. The empire started shrinking as India left by 1947, and colonial holdings across Africa and Asia were released one by one. Manufacturing declined, unemployment rose, and the British pound, once the world's reserve currency, was replaced by the dollar, in a transition that wasn't smooth but violent, economically, socially, and politically. The empire dissolved over 4 decades while the people living through it watched their standard of living collapse in real time. The pattern gets really disturbing when you see that the USSR did the same thing, only faster. The Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991 let military spending consume 15 to 20% of GDP, as they spent themselves into oblivion trying to keep up with the United States in an arms race they couldn't win. By the late 1980s, the economy was stagnant with no new wealth being created, just consumption, borrowing, and selling off gold and silver reserves to import grain because they couldn't even feed their own people anymore. The whole thing came apart not over decades, but over 900 days as the Soviet Empire disintegrated from 1989 to 1991. With satellite states breaking away, the ruble collapsing, and people who thought they were living in a superpower waking up one day in a failed state. If this pattern was obvious in hindsight for them, why are we repeating it now? The pattern is invisible when you're inside it, so let me show you exactly how it works. 7 stages exist, and every single empire that's collapsed has moved through them in order. Stage 1 is sound money, where the empire starts with a stable currency backed by something real like gold, silver, or commodities. And people trust the money because it has intrinsic value. Stage 2 is public works, where wealth starts flowing and the government invests in infrastructure like roads, bridges, aqueducts, and schools. As the society builds during its golden age. Stage 3 is massive military, where the empire gets ambitious and starts expanding territory, influence, and power, which requires a military and a big one, and militaries are expensive. Stage 4 is perpetual war, and this is where the trap closes because once you've built a massive military, you've got to use it. and justify the spending. So the wars start and they don't stop as every conflict justifies the next one and the costs spiral. Stage 5 is currency debasement, and this is where we are now. You can't fund perpetual war with sound money because it's mathematically impossible. So the government starts printing, debasing the currency, and replacing gold and silver with paper, with promises, with debt. For a while it works as the economy keeps growing slowly and people don't notice the value of their money eroding. Because it happens gradually with a little inflation here and a little there until it's not gradual anymore. Stage 6 is loss of faith, where the public wakes up and realizes the money is worthless and that the promises won't be kept. When people lose faith in the currency, they stop using it and hoard real assets like gold, silver, land, or anything tangible. The velocity of money collapses and the economy enters a deflationary spiral even as the currency hyperinflates in what sounds contradictory but is exactly what happens. Stage 7 is currency crisis and collapse, the endgame where the currency fails completely. The empire loses its ability to project power because it can't pay its soldiers, its bureaucrats, or its debts. And the whole system unravels fast while the people at the bottom who trusted the system lose everything. Which stage are we actually in right now? The data tells a story because if this pattern is real, we should be able to see the exact same signs flashing today, and we do. Stage 5 is currency debasement, the replacement of sound money with fiat currency backed by nothing but trust. Severed the dollar from gold in 1971, which was 54 years ago, and since then the dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power. Bread that cost 25 cents in 1971 now costs $3.50, and that's not progress but debasement. The issue extends beyond purchasing power to debt. National debt stands at $36 trillion, which is more than 120% of GDP and growing by about $1 trillion every 100 days. To put that in perspective, Spain's debt spiral took 80 years and Britain's took 40 years, but we're doing it in less than 2 decades. Spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined at over $800 billion a year, and that doesn't include veterans' benefits, intelligence agencies, or the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons budget. Add those in and you're over $1 trillion, which should sound familiar because it's stage 4 bleeding into stage 5. As perpetual war gets funded by currency debasement, the question most people don't want to ask is what happens when the math finally breaks. The math always breaks. It broke for Spain when the silver ran out, for Britain when the debt became unsustainable, and for the USSR when the economy stopped growing. It'll break for us when the world stops trusting the dollar, and that process has already started. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 72% in 1999 to under 59% today as countries quietly move away. China and Russia are trading in their own currencies, Saudi Arabia is pricing oil in yuan, and the de-dollarization trend is real and happening slowly but steadily. When the dollar loses its reserve status, everything changes. Can print trillions of dollars without immediate hyperinflation is that the rest of the world still wants dollars because they need them to buy oil, to trade internationally, and to hold as reserves. Treasuries, instead of buying them, interest rates spike and the cost of servicing the debt becomes impossible. The government faces 2 choices, default or print even more money, and either way, the currency collapses. What does this actually mean for someone with a mortgage, a job, and a shrinking paycheck? Your savings get wiped out as the dollars you've been putting away for retirement lose their value faster than you can replace them. Import prices skyrocket and food, electronics, clothing, and anything made overseas becomes unaffordable. Social unrest follows because when people can't afford to eat, they don't sit quietly but protest and riot, and governments respond with force. We've seen this pattern before in Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Argentina, and it always follows the same script. What nobody tells you is that the collapse isn't one big event, but a cascade, a series of breaking points that accelerate. Inflation ticks up, then jumps, then spirals. A few countries diversify away from the dollar, then a few more than everyone. And interest rates rise slowly, then spike, then become unpayable. Once the cascade starts, it's almost impossible to stop. What comes next if we follow the pattern, and there's no reason to think we won't, are 2 more stages. Stage 6 loss of faith and stage 7 collapse. Stage 6 starts with a loss of confidence not just in the currency, but in the institutions. People stop believing the government can fix the problem, that the Federal Reserve can manage inflation, or that their elected officials care about anything other than staying in power. When trust evaporates, behavior changes. As people pull money out of banks and buy gold, silver, Bitcoin, real estate, or anything that's not paper. The wealthy move assets offshore, the middle class scrambles to protect what little they have, and the poor get crushed. Shortages appear not because there's no food or fuel, but because the supply chains break down. Truckers refuse to deliver goods if they're being paid in a currency that's losing value by the hour. Farmers hoard crops, and manufacturers shut down because they can't afford inputs. The government responds by imposing price controls, capital controls, and currency controls, which only makes things worse because when you try to fix prices below market value, you create black markets that breed corruption and violence. Stage 7 is the endgame where the currency fails completely through hyperinflation or outright abandonment. The government loses the ability to pay its debts, its employees, and its military. As social order breaks down and regional fragmentation begins, states and cities start operating independently because the federal government can't provide basic services anymore. And the people who saw it coming, who prepared, and who held real assets, they survive. While the ones who trusted the system lose everything. Economy is too big to fail, that maybe the dollar is too entrenched to be replaced, that maybe technology changes everything, and that maybe this time is different. Ask yourself this though, isn't that exactly what they thought? The Spanish in 1600 thought their silver would last forever. The British in 1920 thought the empire was untouchable. And the Soviets in 1985 thought communism was permanent. Every empire thinks it's the exception, and none of them are. The uncomfortable truth is that we're not different. The pattern is real, and we're following it step by step. The question isn't whether stages 6 and 7 are coming, but when and how fast. Spain took 80 years to collapse, Britain took 40, and the USSR took less than 3. And the speed is accelerating because information moves faster now and capital moves faster. Once the loss of faith starts, it spreads instantly. Going back to where we started with Nixon in 1971 at Camp David, the night he severed the dollar from gold, and moved us fully into stage 5 was 54 years ago. If the average stage lasts 40 to 45 years, we're overdue, and we're not at the beginning of stage 5, but at the end. Stage 6, the loss of faith, is next. And it could start tomorrow, next year, or 5 years from now, but it's coming because the math doesn't lie. And the pattern doesn't break. The difference between them and us is that we can see the pattern now. We know what stage we're at, and we know what comes next. Whether knowing is enough, whether we'll do what needs to be done, whether we'll demand sound money, fiscal discipline, and an end to perpetual war, or whether we'll become the fourth example in this pattern. As another empire that thought it was different, and another society that ignored the warning signs until it was too late remains to be seen. I can't tell you exactly when stage 6 hits, could be 2026 or could be 2030, but I can tell you this, when it happens, it'll happen fast. The Soviet Union went from superpower to failed state in 900 days, and that's not fear-mongering, but pattern recognition. If you want to see the signs before everyone else does, if you want to understand what's coming while there's still time to prepare, you need to subscribe because when stage 6 hits, everyone's going to be asking how this happened, and you'll already know. The answer has been sitting in the pattern this whole time.